working with Sitecore products for most of my career, pretty much. Been working for Sitecore themselves for about 8 years now, coming up on. Currently, I lead Sitecore's global developer advocacy team, originally from Manchester, based down in Melbourne now. And you can see a variety of social handles and locations on the screen there. So if you want to get in touch or have any questions after this, then feel free to reach out. So what are we going to cover today? Well, I'm not sure how many people have actually touched Discover at all previously. So I'm going to basically do a quick 2-slide introduction, which isn't really going to do it justice, to be honest with you. It's quite a large platform. There's quite a lot of features in there, but it's just to basically kind of get everyone on the same page so we get a rough idea of what the aim of Discover is, really. After that, we're going to talk about the different ways you can implement Discover into your site, so the different implementation options. And then we're going to start to drill into the SDK itself. We're going to look at the 2 primary models it has. It has its eventing model, which is how you can get data out of your site into Discover to start training the AI in the backend. And then the component model, which is how you then use that AI to basically deliver these components, sort of catalog data, to power the catalog data on your site. So let's dive into it. What is Discover? If you go to the Sitecore developer portal today, these are the first 2 sentences you'll see on the Sitecore Discover page. I quite like this. I think this is quite a good description. The long and the short of it basically is that you're kind of enabling merchandisers to have really fine-grained control over what products are displayed to what users and when they're displayed to them. The idea being that the whole game behind this is driving engagement in your site, which then drives conversion. So selling more things. It's a headless platform, so works perfectly well omni-channel, all API first. We're going to be focusing primarily on the web channel today, but if you're working in mobile, in email, and anything else really, Discover can also work across those channels too. So how does it do all this? Well, as I said, it's quite a large platform. When I started looking into it after the company came on board, Reflection, I was surprised at how big it was and how many features are in there. But all of these basically come together, as I said, to kind of enable merchandisers to control the catalog listings on their site. And they do this through things like A/B testing, multivariant testing, the ability to generate like landing pages. All of this, again, though, really it's about boosting the products which are going to drive sales and burying the products which aren't. That's kind of the long and the short of what Discover's here for. So how do you implement it? Well, there's currently 3 different approaches you have when working with Discover. The first is called hosted pages. And with this approach, you provision a reverse proxy for some of your application routes, or even a complete subdomain some of our customers do. And they're pointed directly to Discover's servers. So what happens then is anything on that subdomain or on those app routes are completely served by the Discover servers. So that's quite handy. And you'll notice because of that, like it's quite low on the developer axis on this very rudimentary graph I created. Because it is quite easy to implement. Once the developers configured that reverse proxy or the subdomain, then they're no longer required. The merchandiser can log into the Discover backend, which is called the Customer Engagement Center, or the CEC, which we'll take a look at shortly. But once the developers implemented that, the merchandiser can log into the CEC and they can control everything on those pages themselves. However, that ease of implementation does come with a drawback. And that is, you'll notice that we're not as far along the horizontal axis here. So because you've implemented this way, because it's so easy to implement, you don't quite have the full feature set of Discover available to you. So that's kind of the drawback of going for that approach. The next approach we have is a direct API integration. And now the good thing about this, you'll notice, is that all of the Discover functionality is available. We're all the way to the right on the horizontal axis. But obviously, with this being a direct API integration, that involves a lot more developer work. So that's why we're a lot more vertical in this one. Your developers have to be involved, crafting these experiences all the way through. The merchandisers can control them still once they're built, but the development team has to be heavily involved in actually getting them created. So these are kind of 2 kind of polar opposite approaches here. Really easy to implement with some drawbacks, or more difficult or more involved, let's say, to implement. Well, then you get the full feature set available. Luckily, there is a third option, and that's what we're here to talk about today, and that is the new JavaScript SDK that got released. This is currently in beta. It's due to be released pretty much any day now, I think. But with this API, as with the API approach, you get the full feature set of Discover available, but the development effort is a lot lower than previous. And that's because the SDK is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. A lot of the boilerplate type code you'd have to keep writing when you're doing an API integration. All of that's been handled for you. And you get this really rich set of componentry provided out of the box that you can use to build out your site. So let's take a look at what's in it. As I called out, it is still in beta, not for long, I don't think. I think it's coming out very quickly. But it's basically a React library. So if you're building with React or a framework based on React like NextJS, this is going to be the way you want to go. But if you're building with another JavaScript library, if you're in Angular or Vue or Svelte or one of the others, or maybe another language completely, you could be in .NET or Go or any of the other programming languages out there, then you're not going to be able to use this SDK. It is React only, and you're going to have to look at those other two development approaches I mentioned. What the SDK does, though, is give you complete control over how you can design the experience. So as I'll show you shortly, the thing that's really nice with it is you can kind of dial how much responsibility lies between the developer and the merchandiser for each component. And you can kind of switch between those two different models, and it's quite nice to be able to decide who owns these different components. It comes with two main elements, and that is both separate NPM packages, basically. The first one is the one that's just called React, and that's the main SDK package that provides all the base functionality. And then we have an extra UI package, and that's a load of UI primitives and templates, which we'll take a look at, which are basically pre-built bits of functionality that you can drop into your site. So before we dig into it too much, I do just want to talk a little bit about this scenario we're going to talk through today. Now, obviously, you can take an SDK and you can integrate it into a brand new greenfield project, and that's really easy to do. But what I wanted to show today is just how easy it is to take Discover using the SDK and implement it in a phased rollout onto an already live existing e-commerce site. We're going to be working with NextJS today with Order Cloud on the back end, providing the e-commerce functionality. And I like this example because NextJS is all open source, it's all available to work with today. Order Cloud, you can go and create sandboxes, you can go register a trial account. So you can go and set up NextJS Commerce in about 5 minutes, really quick and easy to get running. It also gives us the opportunity to show the benefits you can get when you combine the static site generation capability of NextJS with the dynamic rendering functionality that Discover provides, kind of getting the best of both worlds. So when all these pieces come together, how do they all interact with each other? Well, when you do a build, Vercel is basically, well, when you do a deploy, or commit, Vercel is going to basically pull down your code out of GitHub, and it's going to pull your commerce data out of Order Cloud. And what it's going to do when it builds your site is it's going to combine both of those together, and it's going to generate all of the pages in your site from that data. And they're all going to be cached as static assets on their CDN. This is their edge server that's globally scaled across all different regions. So then your users come along, they load up their browser, and they go and they request your site, and it's all served blazingly fast from that CDN. This is basically how static site generation works, The load of building these pages is happening at build time instead, so the runtime is really, really fast. When you're working in an e-commerce scenario, like with NextJS Commerce, there is a lot more interactivity compared to the standard static content site. If you think about once you get past the product listing and start trying to buy things, so when you're adding things to your cart, when you're going through the checkout process, at this point, your browser needs to start interacting with your e-commerce provider. And look, there may be a middleware piece involved as well here. It's not always directly requested from the browser to the e-com engine itself. But for all intents and purposes, it is the browser calling indirectly or indirectly your commerce engine to basically, as I said, add products to cart, process the checkout, actually complete the order process. And at this point here, this is basically how NextJS Commerce is configured. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be introducing Discover into this mix as well. So Discover is going to come along, and we're going to start sending event data out from the browser, tracking what our users are doing, and posting that into Discover. We're then going to use that event data to send back catalog components to change dynamically the actual layout and the content of the site. So this is the architecture as a whole for the system we're going to be looking at. But today, really, we're going to be focusing on these two pieces. So how the browser interacts with Discover and how it gets its data back from it. So let's look at the first arrow first, and that's eventing. When you're implementing Discover on a new site, this is going to be where you want to start. because it means you can start to harvest all this rich data about how your customers are interacting with your site before you start to add your componentry to it. So for example, if you go and add in the eventing information, start collecting this data, deploy it out to production, then a week, 2 weeks, a month later, you decide to deploy a most popular products component, for example. As soon as that component goes live, you're already going to have a wealth of data in the back end, populating or basically training the AI to make sure that that data is correct as soon as it goes live. You're not going to have to wait for a few days for the data to get trained for it to become relevant for your users. Now, all these events are built directly into the SDK, but some of them are wired up for you and some of them you have to wire up yourself. If you look at this table here, this is lifted directly from the documentation site, so you can go and see this for yourself. The end column basically makes that distinction. You'll see the top 6 or so rows say yes for JS SDK by React. These are automatically wired up for you. So as soon as you add the SDK into your project, those events are going to start being triggered and sent back to Reflection, back to Discover. The bottom 5, I think it is, these you have to wire up yourself. And there's a reason for that. The bottom 5 are more involved. It's things like adding to cart, it's going to the product detail page. For those type of events, you need to pass in commerce data. So a lot of the time, that's the SKU of the product you're working with. And everyone's e-commerce model is different on every implementation. So there's no way for the SDK to automatically get that SKU data. So things where it's more complex data that's required, you have to hook it in yourself into your application. But as we'll see shortly, it's no big deal. It's really easy to do. So once you've got all this eventing data going through and coming back, we can start to basically add components to our page to leverage that data. And there's 3 different ways you can add components to your page when using this SDK. The first is what's called static components. So these are created in the CC by the developer and then dropped at by the merchandiser or the developer, but they're dropped by a developer at a specific place in your DOM. So what that means is that the developer is saying that this location in the DOM will always be widget number 10, for example, out of the CEC. The merchandiser can go and tweak that widget. They can go and slightly change how it renders itself, but they can't then go and change that widget for something completely different. That's been almost hard-coded, if you like. It's always going to remain as that same widget. The next approach is dynamic components. I kind of like to think of this as similar to a placeholder in XM Cloud, because what the developer does here is they specify an area in the DOM where the merchandiser can then go into the CC and just drop widgets in. And you can have multiple different areas as well. But then the merchandiser can go in and they can add a complete widget, they can take a widget out, they can edit the widgets that are in there. So it's a much more fluid way of working. And this is what I talked about at first, where you're kind of dialing control over the widgets being developer owned or more merchandiser owned. It really depends on the use case for this specific area of the site. Finally, we also have global components. A good example of this is if you think of a standard e-com store, you'll probably have a search bar in the header. That's on pretty much all of your pages. It doesn't change. So that's a global component. It's just added in once and it's the same on every route or page of this site. We also have a heap of kind of supporting assets to help you get off the ground with this. We've got a storybook implementation, which we'll go through shortly, which is awesome. Basically allows you to go and see all the different UI primitives and larger components built on those primitives in action. You can go and interact with them. You can get the code that's used to build them and literally just copy and paste it straight into your site and it'll run. We also have a CLI that's built, which is basically there. If you don't want to do the copy and paste approach, you can use a CLI, which will help provision the same components for you. So we're definitely trying to provide as much support as we can to help people get up and running as quick as possible. Okay, so I think that's enough slides for now. Let's go and actually take a look at some code. So this is a solution we're going to be working with today. This is my NextJS Commerce solution. If anyone hasn't worked with NextJS Commerce before, all of the actual application itself exists in this site folder. And this is a pretty standard NextJS site itself. There's nothing too fancy about it, except for the fact we've got some hooks and libraries in there, which are going to go to Order Cloud and provide our commerce functionality. So first of all, I'm in my site folder. It uses the pnpm package manager. I'm just going to run a dev instance locally, and then we can fire up my browser. And it's not open from before. Let's refresh the page and make sure that works. This is the storefront we're going to be working with, though. For anyone who's worked with NextJS Commerce before, you might notice the catalog's different here, and there's a reason for that. If you go to a NextJS Commerce site, provision an instance with Order Cloud, you get a sample catalog that only has about 4 products, which when you're working with a platform like Discover and you want to show product discoverability isn't really enough. So luckily, the demo team here have been kind enough to lend me their Discover instance, and that has about 100 products in it. So much more bigger catalog data to work with, which is going to be nicer for us going through this. But what we have here is a statically generated commerce store in all effects. Pretty standard B2C storefront. We have a HTML panel up here. We've got some product listing in a marquee, text, another panel, another marquee. We can go through to the product listing page, the product detail page itself. You'll notice it's not as fast as typically statically generated sites when running locally, but that's because I'm running in development mode. So when you run in development mode, it doesn't pre-build all your pages for you. It's going to build them at runtime yourself. So when I click on the page, it's going to have to go and build it itself. It's a little bit slow, but if I was to deploy this out to Vercel, then it would statically generate everything, and that's when you get the page performance increases. So again, pretty standard product detail page. List of all the products that are related, and your typical add to cart and checkout flow. Okay, so I'm going to send this back to the homepage now, and the first thing we want to do is we want to actually go and wire up the eventing information that I said. Now, ahead of time, I have done a couple of things. I've basically gone and installed the packages. So we're using both the React and the UI package here. So those are installed and ready to use. And when we come to the component piece later, I have set up a bunch of components. I've already basically done the copy and paste action from Storybook into here, just to save us a bit of time. But first of all, we're going to look at eventing. So I'm going to start by loading up the _app page here. And for those of you that haven't worked with Next.js before, this is kind of a special control here that wraps every route on your site. So everything in here will basically wrap around it. So this component here is where your page will actually be rendered, but everything that wraps around it is going to be executed on top of it. And we can leverage that by including a widgets provider. And this is the first entry point for the SDK. Include my references. And you can see here, this is coming from the main React library. So we'll include that in, we'll include my environment reference. You'll notice we're passing in some properties into this, and these will come out of my environment file themselves. So the environment we're working in, and this is a production instance of Discover. And then we've generated a customer key and an API key. And these are basically how I tie this specific application to my specific Discover instance in the back end to make sure I'm getting the right data. And it's as easy as that. I can save this page now, this component, and now basically all of my automatically wired up events, so remember the top 6 rows in that table we looked at, they're all going to be start getting sent over. So let's take a look. I can load up my DevTools. I've gone to my network tab, and we're refining by XHR results because it's all dynamic. Discover. If we refresh the page, we should now hopefully see requests going over to Discover. We get some standard Next.js ones, and here we go. We can see we've got requests going over to api.rfksrv.com. They're the Reflection servers. Reflection was the company that we acquired when we brought on Discover. And we can start to see the event data is going over. So here you can see we have an event of type page view, so page view event. And we also get this UUID here. This is my unique identifier as a shopper, as a customer. This is persisted in a cookie in my browser, but you can actually use this as a back-end developer running the site as well, or as a merchandise view. So we can copy that value, and I'm going to hop over to Discover here. I'm on Play Summit, that's the correct one. And I'm going to go into the developer resources and the event monitor. And if I go and paste that UUID in here, we can click Start Monitoring. And this is going to work kind of like a trace. So anytime anyone's interacting with the site using that UUID, we're going to see what happens in the CEC directly. So I can go back to the page here. We can refresh once more. And we'll just wait for this to come up. You can see, here's our request over to Reflection again. If we expand that a little bit more, we can see all the data in there. Yeah, you can see I requested just the home page. It's just a slash for the URI, and we can see the user data. If I go back to the CEC now, you can see we have a single record in here, which is for a page view event. We can expand the event details here, and we can go and see all the data. So we can go in there and we can see that my user triggered this page view event for the homepage. So you can see just by adding that widget provider, we're getting all of this basic event data already going back into Discover. So next we need to wire up some of those events that we need to do ourselves that the SDK can't do for us. So the first one of those I think we're going to look at is the product detail page view. So if we go to product slug, this is the product page itself. And what I'm going to do is we're just going to hook into the slug page here. Oh yeah, here we go. And we're going to use the use effect hook from React. And I'll pull in my references first, and we'll explain it. This basically gets fired every time this component renders. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this function, which comes from the SDK called track PDP view event. And we're going to pass in the SKU for the products being viewed. As I said, you need to do this yourself because everyone's commerce data model is different. So the SDK can't figure out what your SKU is for you. So we need to manually call this. So we can save that page, or that component even. We can go back to the site. And let's click on this lovely set of golf clubs. Once more, it's going to take a little bit just to load the page up for us. And we can see we have another request which has gone over to the reflection servers. If we expand this one, we can see we now have a view event again. Well, this time it's of type, well, the name is the PDP, so product detail page view. Once more, we have my UUID showing it's the same user. And we can see that event data passed in, the SKU for the actual model, the SKU for the product itself. If we go back to the CEC, again, we can see we now have our next event in there, the product viewed event this time. Once more, we can expand that down. And we can see the data that was passed in. We can see the SKU. So this product was viewed by this specific user at this exact time. So it's really nice to get this real-time data back. We're not going to wire up all these events, but I will do one more. Let's do add to cart. That's another one I like. So this doesn't exist on a page. This is in a component. If we go and find our components, I'm looking for products, product sidebar. That's it. So if we look in here, we do have the use effect hook here, and I could hook into that, but then the code would execute every time the add to cart button fires. We don't want that. We want to execute this event every time someone actually clicks the button. So it's slightly different. We're also going to need the path that the user executes it from for this. So I'm just going to quick reference into the next router object that we'll use. And what we're going to do is we have this add to cart function here, and this is what fires when people physically click the add to cart button. This makes the call over to Order Cloud, actually adds it to the cart. That's the most important bit. I want people to be able to actually buy things. So we want to let that kind of execute unobstructed. We're just going to hook in after all that's completed, and we're going to call Discover at the end. So we basically build out this time a more complex data model because we have a few more things to pass over. But we're going to pass over the SKU, the product that we're adding, the quantity, which I just hard-coded for 1 this time, but you could set that dynamically from a drop-down if you wanted, and then the price it was added at as well. Have that reference in as well. So we're going to call this track add to cart event function, pass in that data model, and we'll pass in the path too. If I save that, we'll go back and refresh the page. You may wonder why we pass the path as well. That's because with functionality like add to cart, a lot of e-com stores will let you add to cart from multiple locations. Maybe it's not just the PDP page, maybe from the product listing as well. So including the path in the object can give you more UX data, basically, more UX usage data, showing where people are actually finding the event from. Okay, so we got our page view. We've still got our product detail page view. Let's fire our add to cart. The first request is going to go to Order Cloud. That's physically adding it to the cart that we want to do. And then you can see we get our response, and we're going to make our call over to Discover. We can check that event data, and we can see now we have a different type, A2C, add to cart. My UUID is the same, still tracking myself as the user, and we can see that model's in there. So the price is $299, the quantity which is hard-coded for 1 this time, and the SKU of the product being added. So let's go and take a look in the CEC. And what we can see now is we actually have some add to cart events here, but you can see there's 2 records. If we go and expand the event details themselves, they're actually the same. So It's the same details. We can see where the URL was. That was the path we passed in, and the data for the object we passed in. If we go and take a look at the next one, you can see it's the same. The only difference here is who it's generated by customer and generated by Sitecore. The way this was explained to me by the product team is that some events take more processing on the back end, so they're actually added to a queue to be processed, and add to cart is one of these. So what you're seeing here is the generated by customer row is when the event was physically added to the queue. That was when we clicked the button and we made the request ourselves from the application. The generated by Sitecore record here is when that event is taken off the queue and processed by the backend processing elements. So you may see dual records here for some events, but it'll only ever be one record in your analytics. It won't be duplicated in there. Okay, so at this point, we'd go out and we'd finish wiring up the rest of those events, and then I'd deploy it out to production, just as is. The end users would have no idea that any actual change has been made, but I'd be getting all this rich data coming back about how all my users are interacting with my storefront, and I can then use that to build out my components and deliver a really engaging commerce experience. So components are where we're going to go next. I think before we start to implement them, I think probably the first place to take a look is going to be in the CEC and how they get defined in here. So if we hop over to this widgets panel, here's where all the components and widgets are built out. I mentioned before that I've been lucky enough to get lent the demo team instances here. So you can see there's a whole heap of widgets that they have for their different demos that they run. I have a couple at the top here. It's anything prefixed with REA for Rob Earlham. These are the ones we're going to be working with today. We have a homepage banner and we have a recommended product widget. And you can see the type of the widgets here. There's actually two main types of widgets overall. There are HTML widgets, of which the banner is one here. And with these, the markup and everything is owned by the CEC here. You can create them in their entirety in the CEC. All that data is sent down to the client, and the SDK can just render them straight away. It knows exactly how to render them because all the data has come out of the CEC. With widgets like the recommendation widgets, they're what's known as catalog widgets. For those, the only information that comes out of the CEC and Discover is the actual catalog data itself, the raw catalog data. So how those widgets are displayed basically is owned by your application. So you need to have your components in the application and you need to tell the SDK how to render it. So if you're going to render a recommendation widget, you need to tell the SDK which components you use, basically. Okay, that'll become more obvious as we go through it. So if we take a look at the first one here, you can see they have different IDs as well. That's probably something to mention before we move on. REA home banner. A typical naming convention you'll see is RFKID underscore with an integer. So RFKID 92 is going to be our recommended product widget, for example. But first of all, let's look at our home banner. And we're going to go into our widget settings. And then we're going to change we're not going to change the appearance, but we're going to take a look at how it's been. We can see it's basically, we've got one big image, we've got two big images next to it, and these are going to link off and go and link off to any URL we want. And there's a whole different type of these you can choose from. We go to choose another here, and these are all placeholder images you get just to see an example of how it's going to render. But you can see, there's different article ones, there's different banner ones. There's a whole heap of different examples you can choose from here. You can also completely create your own from scratch. So you get a lot of freedom in how you can enable your merchandise to be able to create these. When you choose an appearance style, that will then give you a set of appearance settings, which are tied to that style. So in our case, 3 images. So in 3 times, we have, the href. So where do we want that image to click and link off to? The URL for the image itself. So what image are we going to use? We're just pulling images out of our DAM instance. And then if we were working in mobile, we'd add some mobile images. That was pretty simple. Let's take a look at our recommended product widget. So once more, I'll go into my widget settings. In here, you have the concept of a recipe. Recipes are used to control what products are going to be displayed by this widget. So if we go and edit this, you can see today what I've chosen is a really simple one. It's just going to give us a random selection of products out of Discover. If I go to choose another here, you can kind of see what other ones are available for you out of the box. And there's heaps. Things, like top ordered products for the last 30 days, products that most appear in abandoned carts, best-selling products. If you look at how small my scroll bar is here, this list goes on and on and on. There's heaps and heaps and heaps of different recipes provided out of the box. You can also go and configure your own. You get this like drag and drop style builder, which you can see a screenshot of here. So you get a lot of freedom in how you can control which products are displayed to your users and for what reasons. Again, we're going to keep it really simple today. We're just going to display a random set of products. I'm more interested in showing the SDK side of things and how powerful the AI is on the back end. Okay, so we have our two widgets. How do we control where on our site they're actually going to display? Well, if we go over to the pages section here we can basically specify a page or a route in our site and what widgets are going to be tied to it. Again, we have our REA homepage here. This is what we're going to be working with. If we click into here, we can see we have just one variation. So I mentioned before, there's A/B testing, multivariate testing built into Discover. If you wanted to change the widgets for a certain segment of your audience, here's where you could create a different variation. Use rules, again, very much like in XP, to control which variants are displayed to which users. Again, we're not going to touch much on this today. We're just going to focus on the components itself. So we're just going to stick with this default variation. Once we click into there, though, we can actually see how these widgets are going to look with real data. So we can see we have our golf clubs again. We've got a bike bell and bike cover, I think that is. And then we've got a set of products which are listed out below. And these are all coming from our REA home URL. And that's what we're going to use to tie it all together. Okay, so we've kind of configured everything as a merchandiser in the CEC. So we need to actually go and start to drop some of this into our application. Before we do that, let's go and take a look at where we think it might fit. I can get rid of my dev tools now. We don't need that. Let's go and head back to our homepage because that's where we're going to be dropping these widgets in. And as I mentioned before, this currently is a statically generated site, blazingly fast. I don't want to lose that. So I could drop my HTML banner up on this top section here, but then you're going to see like this loading spinner when you first load the site, which isn't great. I want to kind of keep everything below the fold. I think that's why I'm going to keep my dynamic elements. My monitor resolution is quite big, so I think the bottom of this HTML banner is probably the fold for most people. So if I keep going down, we've got a marquee here, we've got some text data, but we've got another HTML banner down here. And we also have another product listing down here, which looks very similar to what we had previewed in the CEC. So I'm going to replace these with those widgets that are controlled by the merchandiser. So let's hop back to our application. And the first thing we're going to do, we're going to go back to our app. And remember I said we need to tell the SDK how to render catalog type widgets. And to do that, we're going to use the set widget type hook, which is provided out of the React library, the React SDK library. And again, I'll just pull in my references here and talk through it. So what we're saying here is anytime that we try and render a recommendation widget, if I don't explicitly tell the SDK to use a component out of my application, we're going to fall back and use this generic recommendation component. And you can see this is a component within my application itself. So I mentioned before that I've created a bunch of components ahead of time, and these all exist in this Discover folder. So if we go and look in this generic recommendation component here, it's pretty straightforward. There's not too much to it. We basically call this use recommendation method out of the SDK again, which is going to get me a bunch of products returned. And then we're going to basically iterate through those products and render out a component designed to render out component data, product catalog data, basically. Pretty straightforward. So let's make sure I save the app.tsx page. And then we can actually start to go and drop some of this into our page itself. And as I said, we're going to be working with our main index page today. Jump back up to the top. What we need to do first is we need to tie this page in my application to that specific definition of a page in the CEC where we added our widgets in. To do that, we're going to, again, make use of the use effect hook. I'll put that in a bit nicer. Pulling my references again. So yeah, once more, the use effect hook is part of React. It's going to be executed every time that this component renders itself. And what we're saying here is basically whenever this renders, we're going to leverage this functionality out of the SDK. So there's a page controller in there, and we're basically going to tie this component, this page we're rendering here, to this URL in the CEC. Remember, that was the name of the page that we defined in there. After we've done that, we're going to call this use page widgets function, and that's going to return us an object with a few properties in there. The first is an isLoading property. So that will give us the opportunity to basically, when that Boolean is true, we're waiting from data from Discover. So that gives us the opportunity to output like a nice spinner or something to make it a little more interactive for users while we're waiting for that data to come back. And then the actual data itself, which is going to be the collection of the widgets. Okay, so I think first of all, we're going to try the dynamic way of loading widgets. Remember I said that's kind of similar to a placeholder in XM Cloud. So you can go and basically define an area in the DOM where the merchandiser in the CEC can just go and start dropping components in. And so we have our first grid here above the fold. I don't want to change that. We've got a marquee, a hero. The second grid, this is where I wanted to drop it in. Let's comment that out. And we'll just drop this code in, and then I'll talk through it. Okay, so put my references in again. So what do we have here? We've basically got a div, and we've got two conditional statements here. And they're basically switching on the state of this isLoading Boolean. So we'll only ever get one of these rendered at any time. First, when we are loading, when we're waiting for the data back, it's going to output a div with the loading text. Again, you could output something more interactive, a nice spinner or something here. We're going to keep things simple today. When that's finished and we have the data back, isLoading will be false. So once that happens, we're then going to take all of the widgets that come back, and for each of them, we're going to render this generic widget component. What that means is that if this is a HTML widget, then the SDK knows how to render that already. So it's just going to render the HTML it gets back from the CEC. If it's a catalog type widget, then it will fall back to whatever widget type we've told it to use for that type of widget. So remember before we said, if I don't tell you what type of components you use for recommendation widgets, use the generic recommendation widget component. So that's what's going to happen in this case. So we can save that. We'll go back to the page and I'll refresh so we can actually see this in action. Let's see if I can be quick enough to see the loading text. Here we go. And then hopefully we should get some widget data coming back. It's going to work. Or the demo god's smiling on me. No, it hasn't worked. Why is that? Okay, let me make sure I actually saved all my pages. Oh, that's going to be a little frustrating. Okay, these are all saved. That's correct. We have my use effect hook in there. Let's refresh the page once more. Oh, that is annoying. Why is that not working? Interesting. I haven't seen this error before. Okay. Well, typically what's going to happen is it would render those components in there. Let's make sure I haven't missed anything. So we've got our div in there with the different components. We have our use effect hook in there. That all looks correct. REA home. We've told it how to render that widget. Anything of interest in here? Let's try and restart our server here. That shouldn't make a difference though. In the chat over there. The demo gods are never kind. You're right, Gabe. I ran this session last night for the Perth user group, and it all worked perfectly. So I'm not sure why you guys are the unlucky ones.
There is another question from in the chat.
Yeah. Where can the JS SDK to learn more? Yes. So I'll cover that at the end. We have the SDK available in beta. Yeah, it's all available on our doc site, though. The main doc site, it's all there to go and look at. Okay, I'm not seeing any data come back now. That's really interesting. This is not going to be fun if none of the components work, because that's most of the rest of the demo. Okay, so it says that's all loaded up now. Okay, we have the page coming back. No, it's usually significantly faster than that, which is quite annoying. Okay, there's something not going right there for some reason. Typically, what you would see would be those two widgets rendering here. I'm not sure why that isn't working this time. The next thing I wanted to show, and we'll keep moving and see if everything's going to fail, because that's going to be really frustrating. The next thing I wanted to show was statically placing components. So I mentioned before that a developer can take a specific component and render it at a specific place in the DOM. So the plan is next to basically replace this marquee here with the actual recommendation widget that we created before. So if I hop back to my code, we have our grid, and we have our marquee here. Let's comment that out and paste that in. We'll add the marquee recommendation component. Again, this is another component that I created ahead of time. It's exactly the same as the generic one, but it appears in a marquee, basically. So you get a nice scrolling effect. What you'll see here, though, is that it's been hard-coded to a specific reflection ID. So RFK ID 92 was the ID of the widget in the CEC. So what the developer is saying at this point is that at this point in the DOM, it's always going to be that recommendation widget. The merchandiser could go and change that widget in the CEC. They could change the recipe behind it. They could change what products are rendered, but they can't change it for a different widget entirely. Let's save that page, and then we refresh here. Okay, we have loading. Feels like none of my widgets are going to work, which is very disappointing.
I'm gonna check the network tab and see if there is any. I think I saw like a 400 or something like that.
Add request, page not found for URI. REA home. Did I accidentally change something in there? REA home is there. That is very strange. Ah, why has that been cleared? That is bizarre. And page settings, page name. Oh yeah, the URL is correct. It's correct in here. Okay, I'm gonna have to go and look at this after this, I think, because that's a little bit annoying. As I said, it worked fine last night. You can imagine there would be widgets that get displayed at this point. The idea is you're going to go and replace these widgets with basically ones controlled out of the CEC. The last thing I was going to show, which I'm not going to attempt to show this time, is basically replacing out the search with preview search as well. The cool thing that you get around that is you can start to leverage Storybook, but I will show this first. Storybook gives basically an example of how all these different UI components exist. So for example, we have like pagination components, which show how you can basically leverage these pagination controls directly. So there's a pagination primitive. And the nice thing about Storybook is you can go and click through and see how it's going to function in your site. This is a real instance of that component you're interacting with. So you can see how the first and the previous and the next arrows disappear. You can see, for example, how a sort would appear in your site. So if we scroll down to the bottom here, I think it is, we can see, different styles of sorting that are available. You can see how they would basically look and appear in your site. On top of this, we have the concept of what's called templates. And templates take these different primitives and combine them into bigger pieces of functionality. So a good example of this is search results. So here you can see, you can create an entire page's search results as a single widget. And this leverages the sort primitive we just looked at. It leverages, there's quite a few results here, let's scroll down. It leverages the pagination primitive we looked at the bottom. The cool thing about this is, here's where you actually get examples of all the sorts. So you can basically take this piece of JavaScript here, all built out using the UI primitive. You can just copy and paste it in as a component directly into your site. And the same with the styling here. The styling is built using style components that allows you to specify CSS as JavaScript objects. But that means you can basically go and drop this into your site, and it'll get you kind of 70% of the way there. It'll show in your site looking like this, and it's kind of good enough for you to be able to test functionality as a developer, and then hand it off to someone who can do CSS, which isn't me at all. It also makes it really quick for doing POCs, so you can drop these components into your site really quickly and easily. I did mention there's another option for people who don't want to copy and paste, and that is the CLI. So if we go back into here, we can see at the root of my site, I have this SC Discover settings.json. This basically specifies where in my site all my Discover components exist. It's in this Discover folder. The CLI basically lets you go and run an npx SC Discover new widget command. And it's going to take me through an interactive prompt to go and create a component for me. The nice thing about this is you also get TypeScript now. So NextJS Commerce is in TypeScript, but a lot of those components I was working with before were just JavaScript. I just copy and pasted them in there. When they work, it shows that they that you can basically use them as is without any editing. But if you go through the CLI, you can get a TypeScript version, which is nice. So we can do that. And let's create a recommendation gallery. You'll see it confirms that your settings are there. So it's, do you want to use that file? Yes or no? And we'll give it a name. Gallery. And we can see it's generated an entire TypeScript component for us. Again, you get your styling file in here with your CSS, but you get your actual main piece of functionality as well. So we can scroll down, and all of the JavaScript functionalities there, it all works. All of the UI elements are down here at the bottom. So it becomes, again, a really quick way for you to go and basically provision these components in your application, have them wire up and work most of the time with Discover. Okay, so that's a little disappointing, but never mind, it is what it is. We'll move on to a conclusion. Basically, the thing I like about this is you can kind of do as much or as little as you like with Discover. And what I mean by that is, we have customers who have handed over every single piece of catalog rendering areas of their site and their different channels to Discover. They render it all with Discover. And it's great to see them go all in on that. But you don't have to. You can be really targeted with it. You could just use specific areas of your site to render commerce data out of Discover. And either way is good. You don't have to go all in. You don't have to be sparing with it. You can use it as much as your use case basically requires you to. On top of that, it's just as easy to implement this on an existing e-com site as it is with a new greenfield project. And that's another thing I really like about this. Today, we showed using Order Cloud on the back end with NextJS Commerce. It could have been Salesforce Commerce Cloud. It could have been Commerce Tools. Any e-com vendor out there, Discover can go and sit across the top of it. So the question was, where can you get access to the SDK? So it's all documented on our documentation site now. You can also, when you start a project with Discover, you'll be assigned an implementation expert or guide. If you speak to them, they can help guide you through it as well. And there's lots of support around using the SDK. We want people to use it. So you have things like Storybook we showed, the CLI, basically everything to try and help make your implementation as simple as we can. Okay, so that's kind of everything I had to show you folks today. I am going to be recording this video to put on our YouTube channel, I think next week after I do one more instance of these sugs.